And Abby's going to talk about the work of her former graduate student who is now a postdoc, right? No.
Still finishing this quarter.
Oh, she's finishing this quarter. Okay. Who has been thinking about maize yield, corn yield in a changing climate. So, and in particular, how the plants can change in response to climate change. So it's a little bit more nuanced than what you read earlier. So I'll let you take it away. And Abby, is a professor in the biology department and in atmospheric sciences at UW. So she crosses the climate biology boundary, which a few others on campus do. And we're going to hear from Lauren Buckley, who also brings in both those perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, Swann. And I'd say Lauren and I come from the opposite sides of that boundary. So Lauren really trained in the biology side, and I've trained more as a climate scientist, and we're both working on problems that cross those boundaries. So as Luann said, I'm going to talk today about work by Jennifer Shao, who is a student in my lab the last several years. She's just finishing up her PhD now. So I'm basically going to tell you about the wonderful things that she did. And I'm happy to talk also about the implications of this for other things that you all are interested in. We had several collaborators on this work, including Soo-Hong Kim, who is here at UW, and Nathan Mueller and Dennis Timlin. So the idea here is that we're interested in maize under a changing climate, agriculture more broadly, but we're gonna do this by looking at maize, and we're gonna think about how maize will perform differently under future climate and what it is about maize that determines its performance. So the traits that the plants have. Maize, just to start out with, is a cereal crop with the largest global production. US is the largest single producer. We grow up to 41% of the total maize. This is the maize yield over time since about the 1960s in the US, and you can see that there's been a very large trend in this yield. So the amount of maize that we are producing per area of land is increasing. So we are getting more corn out of each plant or planted area than we were in the past. This is due to a combination of breeding and management. So breeding new varieties of maize that are very high producing, and management approaches in combination with that breeding. So the ability to plant many more plants closely packed together in an area of land is one of the major contributors to an increase in yield. Large applications of fertilizer, those kinds of things are considered management. So a lot of this we call green revolution of an increase in yield is due to changing the plants themselves and changing the way that we grow them, and some of those things in sort of direct combination. So they had to breed plants that had more upright leaves in order to plant them densely close together. Those two things together allowed yield to increase a lot. But there's a major question about how this will change going into the future. So what will the trajectory of maize yield look like as we go into a future climate? We really don't know what this spread is. We know that there are impacts from climate on maize and other crops. We could think about this generally as a discussion of what crops would look like, but some of the specific things about maize is it has a slightly different photosynthetic pathway than other crops like wheat or rice. But they're all impacted by temperatures, sunlight, amount of water that they get, and hot temperatures are seen to decrease yields. So when it gets too hot, we see that crops suffer from that. So we don't know exactly the precise amounts of those climate impacts. We have some uncertainty in the projection of the climate itself and a lot of uncertainty in how the plants will respond to that climate. The specifics of exactly how the climate changes during the season and what that'll do to maize yield. We also don't know what the human component is going to be. What types of adaptations will we come up with will also impact the yield going forward. So first, just looking at the climate component, this is a model intercomparison of agricultural projections for the future, looking at maize yield changes at the end of the century for a fairly high or for a high emission scenario, looking at current growing regions. And so you can see that there's projected to be pretty big declines from this set of simulations. We are in this talk going to focus on the US Corn Belt here, but we could think of applying this globally as well. But we're going to use data from the US Corn Belt. But the projections from these models are that without major interventions of some kind, we take our current plants and we run them into the future under future climate, we think those yields are likely to go down. So let's talk about what makes a maize plant grow. What do plants need? What are they affected by? Well, temperature is going to affect the development of the plant through its life cycle. So maize and most food crops that we eat are grasses. And so they're going to have a sort of annual life cycle where they grow leaves and then eventually flower and produce grain from that flower. So temperature can speed them through that life cycle, which can change the eventual yield that you get at the end. They're also impacted by the dryness of the air. So the vapor pressure deficit is the way we quantify that, the difference between the saturated vapor pressure of water and the actual vapor pressure of water in the air. But you can think of this as just dry air. So dry air is going to make it harder for them to keep their stomata open, which are the valves through which they take carbon dioxide. So dry air will make them basically lose water, or to avoid losing water, they'll have to shut down a bit. So this impacts their water status. And then a third major factor that we know might be changing with climate is carbon dioxide. So in general, carbon dioxide, as it gets bigger, will increase plant growth. Plants use CO2, break it apart, and turn it into sugar. That is the process of photosynthesis. If there's more CO2, it's a little bit easier for the plant to diffuse it from the air inside the plant, and that allows it to run photosynthesis a little bit while losing less water is one of the main trade-offs. And so corn is actually a kind of photosynthetic pathway where this is easier already without needing this increase in CO2, but we still see that more CO2 benefits corn plants. They tend to grow better. So we've got these multiple factors going on, right? It's getting warmer, the air is getting drier, but the CO2 is also going up, and we have to understand the relative balance of these things and how much water the plant has available. So in some earlier work, Jennifer looked at this specifically by breaking apart these three factors. How much does temperature impact yield? If it's just temperature that's changing and everything else is held constant, how much does just making the air drier impact yield, and how much does just CO2 impact yield? And so if we look at that, how mechanistically why it matters for the plant, we can break it into three different mechanisms. So it can change the length of the growing season that the plant can grow. It can change the rate at which the plant photosynthesizes, and it could change the total leaf area. And so the total leaf area would just allow the plant to photosynthesize more overall. And what she finds is that increasing the temperature and making the air drier both cause the yield to go down independently. So even if you don't change temperature at all, if you make the air drier, the yield of the plant goes down. And that mostly happens for temperature because the growing season length goes down. So as it gets warmer, the plant just speeds through its life cycle, and it doesn't have as much time to spend growing grain, is the simple way I think about it. So it just spends less time stocking carbon away into grain, and so it has a lower yield. There's a little bit of an impact on photosynthetic rate and leaf area. It actually makes them both higher, which should help. So this growing season length is decreasing the yield because it's getting shorter. Vapor pressure deficit, or this dry air, can also have an impact on growing season length, but it does the opposite in terms of photosynthetic rate and total leaf area. It makes the photosynthesis go down. The plant shuts down a little bit during the dry air, and that also ends up leading to a shorter growing season and less total leaf area. But one of the interesting things here is that the actual total magnitude of these two things is kind of equal. we often think about the impact on yield as just being due to temperature. And in the BTC paper that you read, they just assume temperature is the driver of why yield goes down. But when we dig into the mechanisms of what's actually going on in the plant, it's likely a lot of that is due to the air being dry. Those two things are usually really correlated in real conditions. And so it's hard to separate them out in observations the way that they would have been looking at in that paper. But when we dig into sort of the mechanisms of how the plant is growing, it's possible a lot of it is due to the dry air and not just to the temperature. And that's important when we project into the future because those correlations may not stay the same in the future. So we're getting sort of one level more into what the plants are doing than just assuming that they respond to temperature. If we add carbon dioxide in here, we see that that makes the yield go up. So more CO2, more yield. And the reason it goes up is because it makes the growing season longer and it increases the photosynthetic rate. So the plant can actually save water when there's more CO2, and that lets it have a longer growing season and a higher photosynthetic rate. And so then the question is, when we put them all together, what happens? Because we actually think all three of these things are going on. In this case, we find that it leads to a small overall decline. That carbon dioxide is offsetting the negative impacts of the temperature and the vapor pressure deficit. But the point is here, we wanted to dig into why the plants are responding, not just that they responded, but looking at what it's doing to the plants, which is going to relate to what I'll show you about with our next stages. So this helps inform our expectation of why yield might change. So that was a little bit about the climate impacts. I want to tell you briefly about what are some ways that we could adapt. So many things could be changed from the human side of managing agriculture. And so we have some capacity for adaptation. This is a quote from the working group 2 about changes in crop choice and management practices that can mitigate negative impacts or take advantage of beneficial opportunities. But in many cases here, we're thinking about mitigating harm. So we may still end up with less yield overall, but the drop isn't as large. So what does this look like? Some examples are changing cultivars. A cultivar is a type of plant that people have bred to have desired traits. I just think of it as like a variety. If you're a gardener, it's like the specific variety of the plant that you pick to grow in your garden. So there are cultivars, and these are things that get bred, and they could be used in different places. So we could change which cultivars are grown where. We could move the cultivars from southern locations to the north as climate warms, because they might perform better as climate gets warmer. A second definition here is trait. So a trait is a measurable attribute that can be inherited and or environmentally determined. So sometimes this is an outcome and sometimes this is a property of the plant. So things like yield, disease resistance, kernel size, protein content, et cetera, something you could measure about the plant. And so cultivars will often be bred to have certain traits. Like I mentioned before, corn was sort of purposely bred to be more upright and have more upright leaves and be shorter so that they could be packed closer together into a single area of land, and that led to much higher yield. So then some things that we could do from a more human side, we could change the timing of when we plant crops. So we could plant them earlier in a warmer climate that might help them do better under a warmer climate. We could change the way we apply fertilizer or irrigation. And we could even change the types of plants that we're growing somewhere. So we could choose to grow a different crop entirely. These are all just possible adaptations. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. But just so you have in your head, like, what are the ways we could adapt agriculture. So specifically for these changes we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at changing cultivars or changing varieties of plants along with some management. So along with the choice of planting date and the planting density, how closely we plant them together. And we're going to look at what the impacts of those are on yield. Just to say a little bit about how corn or crops in general are bred. Generally, the way it works is you start with the genetics. You start with a giant, they call it a germplasm, but you start with sort of all the varieties of plants that a seed company might have. They would select for the desirable traits that they're looking for. And they would sort of grow lots of plants, select for the ones that had the things they wanted, and then they would eventually select some candidates that they wanted to try growing. And then they would have those grown under real conditions and under real types of management and sort of trial them out and see if they had the performance that they were hoping for. And these is so there's this combination between the genetics of the plant, the management, and the environment that the plant is in that eventually determine the yield that it has. And this is eventually at the end where you would commercially release a cultivar, and then it gets sort of unofficially more tested as lots of farmers grow it. This is a time and resource intensive process. So part of what we're trying to talk about here is a way that you could shortcut some of this or create some more sophisticated hypotheses to jump through some of this process. So then you would repeat this process after you have your commercially released cultivars. So there's this genetics, management, and environment landscape. And this is the way it's traditionally done, but we want to basically explore a lot more of this space and to do it in a simulation so that we can try to hypothesize what those plants should look like before they actually go and grow them, to let you explore a lot more possibilities than you would actually be able to do if you had to grow all the plants. So you can think about it like this. It's actually a landscape. Maybe there's multiple places where you could have higher performance, but when you do it in the traditional way, the way you select down first and then expand back out again, you might be missing some of those traits or trait combinations that could actually do well. So we want to be able to explore this landscape. Traditional breeding is very time intensive. Initial breeding to commercial release is approximately 5 to 7 years, and the whole cycle up to delivery and adoption can take up to 30 years. So that is a long time scale when we're thinking about climate change. If we need to come up with new plant varieties, this is pretty slow way to do it. So the signal of climate yield impact is expected to emerge from the noise by 2030 to 2050, meaning we don't have 30 years to develop new cultivars in order to mitigate yield loss. So we need the cultivars and management strategies targeted for climate adaptation now, and we can use models to help do that. So we're going to try to explore this landscape. We want to find multiple, or if there are multiple high points and what they are. And so we can use simulations to explore a lot more of this space than taking a single path through it. All right, we're not going to actually look at the genetics. We're just going to look at, at traits. So if we were really trying to dig into the genetics, we would want to build a model that was based on the actual genes and how they function. We are doing this at a higher level, so we're going to be looking at the plant traits, aspects of them that you could measure more directly than by looking at their genes. So I'll tell you today a little bit about the framework that Jennifer developed to explore this trait management environment landscape. What makes for high performance of crops under today's climate, and how might top performing trait and management shift under future climate. Okay, so first the framework. Actually, are there any questions before I move on? Yeah.
This is maybe outside the scope of this research project, or it certainly is, but I'm wondering, like, have you guys looked into what the either health or like climate in like carbon consequences of these changes in the maize? Like, you know, if people eat the maize that has been genetically engineered to be different, does that have or when they grow more maize in a smaller amount of area, does that change like the nutrient density of that food?
So that's not something that we've looked at. That's sort of a different set of science questions in terms of I think the question about nutrient content is usually related to more CO2 might dilute so in general, if plants have more carbon dioxide available, but nutrients are still limited to them, then it's possible that they would grow more carbon relative to nitrogen, for example. So I think there's some concern that nutrient content of crops could go down. That's kind of a different research question. And in terms of, yeah, how planting density or something like that has affected carbon content, it's kind of also a different question. We're really asking, like, just from the plant perspective, what should the plant look like to perform at the highest rate? And like I said, this is focused on maize, but this kind of and part of the reason we're showing you the framework is this kind of approach could be used for any other crop as well, if we could, right, if we wanted to use a model of that plant type. Yeah.
One of your earlier slides, I was wondering why in the increased temperature, you see an increase in leaf.
Why there's an increase in leaf area with an increase in temperature. Well, there was a slight increase in photosynthetic rate. So I would have to double check, but I'm going to guess it's because it turns out while plants will suffer when it gets too hot, if it's not quite at the sort of optimum temperature, they might photosynthesize a little bit better when it gets hotter. I remember that being a little bit of a surprise. We thought that they would photosynthesize less as we made it hotter, but it turned out they photosynthesized a little bit more. My guess is the leaf area comes from that. Okay.
It's not growing season increases. It's just
It could be, but most corn plants have a fixed number of leaves. So this is a weird thing about corn, and I'm going to show you this, but most corn plants have a fixed number of leaves that they grow to. So this is actually one of the traits that can be bred for. They'll just grow up to 12 leaves or 20 leaves or something. And so they grow their leaves, and once they grow their leaves, they're done growing their leaves and they move on to growing grain. So it's more the size of the leaf that they end up growing. So number of leaves, yes, but in that simulation, I think we kept the number of leaves the same. In other plants, I would think that it would be, yeah, like a tree could grow more leaves. But it turns out grasses are weird and they just grow a certain number of leaves. Okay, let me move on and show you a little bit more about corn. So we're using a process-based crop model called MaizeSim. It's going to simulate the growing season of corn on an hourly time step. So it takes in climate information, solar radiation, rainfall, carbon dioxide, something about humidity and temperature. It's going to represent how the plant opens and closes its stomata, which are valves that take in carbon dioxide and loose water. It's going to that's going to be sensitive to the water that the plant has available, these environmental conditions, how much it's photosynthesizing. It's going to calculate photosynthetic rates. It's also going to calculate the phenological development through a season. So how fast the plant's going to grow, when it's going to reach those different life stages, like switching over from growing leaves to growing, flowering and growing grain. And it'll keep track of how much carbon goes to different parts of the plant. It takes into account water needs and water stress of the plant, which can then influence these other factors. So now I'm going to show you a little animation of sort of how corn actually grows. So the corn sort of grows its first leaf and then keeps growing those other leaves. The leaves that have already grown will continue elongating until they reach their full length, and then they will start they'll start senescing. So they'll stop being as productive and eventually stop being productive at all as the plant continues to grow more leaves. You can see those leaves at the bottom are no longer functioning. And then when it gets to its number of leaves that it's going to grow, it flowers or tassels and then flowers. It's called silking. And then after that point, it can grow its cob or its corn kernels. And then for the rest of the season, it's going to sort of continue using the carbon that it takes up through photosynthesis to stick it into that corn cob. Eventually, all of the leaves senesce, and then we get to the end of the season and we can harvest the corn. And this is the actual yield that we're talking about in this case. So we're going to explore in this model setup a whole bunch of different possible combinations of traits that the plant could have and management choices that we could make. So specifically, we're going to look at these ones. Don't worry about them specifically too much, but they're going to represent things about the physiology of the plant, things about the phenology or the timing of life stages of the plant, things about its morphology, sort of what shape it has, how many leaves, things like that, how fast they develop, and management. And specifically for management, we're looking at planting date and planting density. And we're going to take a range of each of these values in the model that is within the literature of things that are potentially going to happen or that you could have in a plant. And we're going to randomly assign them within that range to something average, above average, below average. So this would be one example of a corn plant. It would just have these above average, below average values for each of these traits or trait management combinations. We're going to do this a whole bunch of times. So we're actually going to do it 100 times. We're going to make 100 trait management combinations with a particular way of sampling that randomly. So these are 100 randomly selected combinations of these 10 factors that we're looking at. Then we're going to say, okay, so we've got our 100 possible corn trait management combination plants. We're going to test them out at growing places where corn is grown now in the US. So we've got an ensemble of hourly meteorology at these locations, which are all within the US corn growing region. That's the current corn yield in the background in green there. And these triangles all represent places where we have a data series up somewhere between about 12 and 25 years long of data. So this is real meteorology data from stations. And we're going to run each of our 100 plants at each one of these about 1,000 site years. So each ensemble will have 1,000 site years for each of our 100 plants, about 100,000 simulations. We're going to look in the present, and then I'll tell you how we are going to change that for the future. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive look at all possible traits, but more chosen to cover a range of processes in the model and to get a sense for what ends up mattering for trade-offs for the plant. So there's other things we could potentially choose, but this covers different things we think different types of processes we think should matter. So yeah, about 100,000 simulations per ensemble. We're going to do a couple of ensembles. So this is our exploring of the trait management environment landscape. So environment being those 1,000 site years, trait management combinations being our 100 plants. And we want to think about how this changes the performance of the plant. So we have to define what is performance. And we are going to use a specific definition, but we could take other definitions. Specifically, we're looking at yield and yield volatility. So we want the plant to be high yielding. We want it to produce a lot of grain, but we also don't want it to have a very large volatility between years. So we are favoring that it do well most of the time, as opposed to doing super well in one year and really terribly in other years. So those we're going to weigh those things. In this case, I'm going to show you results where we weigh them equally, but we can adjust that preference for one or the other in how we determine performance. So we can take that axis here. So the x-axis is going to be standardized yield. So that's one of our factors for performance. And the y-axis is standardized, is basically volatility. We're going to use the dispersion index to calculate that. And this is sort of our overall look at their performance generally. In this case, we're looking at all sites together. So this is yield and yield volatility, and here's our 100 trait management combinations. So you can see that they fall across the space in terms of what their yield is and how volatile it is in time. And if we define, the way that we've defined performance says that this bottom corner with the orange dot is the theoretical best performance, that we would have the highest yield and the lowest volatility. So we'd have high yield and it would have high yield every year. And so we're just going to define performance as the distance to this best performance spot. And then we can quantify the performance of each of these trait management combinations. So now I'm going to color the points based on their performance. So you can see the purple is showing you just what you can see, the distance to that bottom corner. Those plants have higher performance, those trait management combinations. And you can see that there's some multiple groups that are kind of coming out as having different combinations of high yield and low dispersion. So there are some plants that are very high yielding but have higher volatility. And there's other plants that aren't quite as high yielding, but they have low volatility. And in our definition of performance, they're both doing well. So in each of these dots is actually 1,000 site years. So we've condensed a lot of the data. This is a sort of big overview picture of these trait management combinations. I'm going to expand this out a little bit for you and show you all of the sites. So this now across the x-axis is sites. Each site, remember, there's multiple years. So a site is defined by its location. It has particular soils, and we expect it has some climate at that location. The higher performers here are at the top. The lower, we've ordered them by their average performance, lower performers at the bottom. But you can see that there are some locations that are picking up different high performers than others. So there's some variation across location. Today, I'm mostly going to show you the averaged picture from all of this, but we've also dug into why they would do differently in different places. So our big questions are why and where. I'm going to mostly tell you why generally first, and then we'll come back a little bit at the end to show where. Okay, so that's the framework of how we're doing this. And then I'm going to show you what it is that actually makes them perform well in the present day. So here's our yield and yield volatility space again. Remember that we want there to be, there's yield along the x-axis and volatility along the y-axis. And we've defined performance in this way. So we're going to now sort of take these top 20-ish performers that are circled here, and we're going to look at what characteristics they have and what we can learn about what is making them perform well. So these are our top 20 performers, and you can see just by the fact that if you look across a row, you don't see a consistent color, that there are various trait management combinations that can confer high performance. And you're not meant to be able to see anything more than that from this, other than that it's not a completely consistent picture. They don't all look the same. But it's actually pretty hard to dig into these actual parameters to understand what the plant is doing. So we're going to look at some emergent properties instead. So we're going to look at some ways in which these combinations of traits lead the plant to perform, like other aspects of what we can measure about the plant. So some things we could look at photosynthetic rates. We could look at the opening and closing of stomata. We could look at the total leaf area, the amount of water that gets used, things about the timing of the season, when the plant emerges, when it starts filling grain, or when it switches from growing leaves to growing grain, how long it's able to grow grain for. So we think these things all could be important, and these are a little bit easier to think about in terms of why they would influence the plant's performance. So we're going to look at this space, which I'll define for you, to look at how these emergent properties affect performance. Remember that performance is, we want it to be high yielding and have low volatility. So this is a partial correlation coefficient with high yield across the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have a partial correlation coefficient with low volatility. So we want, this is telling you about the parameter value and how it correlates with the yield. So across this space, we have high values correlating with high yield. Across this space, low values correlating with high yield. The value of the parameter could be either one, that's fine, but the main thing is that we want to see if it has an impact on the yield. And therefore, those both have the same impact on yield. They just happen to have different positive or negative values of the parameter, or the emergent property, sorry. And then on this axis, the y-axis, we have high values correlating with low volatility, low values correlating with low volatility. So same thing, those both have a lot of sway. but one of them, the emergent property would be positive and the other one it would be negatively correlated. So basically what this means is that we have quadrants where the correlation, the value, we want the thing, let's say we want there to be more leaf area to have higher yields, but more leaf area might actually increase volatility. So is these gray areas, the volatility and the yield are working against each other. They're antagonistic to each other. So if you, I think, yeah, here we put leaf area on here. If we have more leaf area, it's helping out with yield, but it's hurting in terms of volatility. So there's a trade-off for this parameter or for this emergent property. We can put the rest of them on here in these white quadrants. It's obvious, it's a win-win. Great, that thing going in that direction helps it have higher yield and lower volatility. It's going to help it perform better. But if you're in these gray quadrants, there's some trade-off that's happening where it's helping it perform better in one way, but worse in another way. And as I alluded to before, the farther you are away from the center of this axis, the more impact you have. So this small pink circle, there's just not that much impact either way. But this larger, if we're farther out from the center, it's having more impact on the yield. So in particular, we find three of these emergent properties that are have a large impact on performance. The leaf area, as I mentioned, the grain filling start time, so when the plant makes it to the stage where it can start making grain, and how long it's able to make grain for. And you can see that two of these fall in this gray quadrant, meaning they're helping with yield, but they're making the volatility worse. The grain filling start time seems to be, yes, it should definitely go in that direction because it's making it higher yield and lower volatility. So these three things on here are the grain filling start time would be the time in the season. The grain filling duration would be how long that phase of growth can last or in the growing season, and then the total leaf area. Okay, I know that one's a little confusing. I think we should move on and show you what comes out of it because that might help explain it better. Okay. So then we'll look back at these top performers and see how they perform in terms of these three factors. So what we did is we defined some strategies to get to high performance. And we gave them kind of qualitative descriptions, but we found them quantitatively through cluster analysis of this performance space. So what we find is that we can define these three things: the leaf area or the canopy size, the start of the grain filling season, and the duration of the grain filling season. And we're going to look at how it varies first, how we can get different combinations of these that lead to high yield. So the first group we found, we called slow aging, the slow agers. They have an early transition to growing grain. They have a long lifetime where they fill grain and a very small canopy. So they are trading off by having a small canopy by sticking around for a really long time. And if we want to look at these three factors, the grain filling start date, the grain filling length, and the leaf area, we're going to look at the middle here would be the average value across all of our 100 plants. And we're going to look if they were lower than average or higher than average for each of these three things. So our slow agers have grain filling that's earlier than the average. They have grain filling length that's longer than the average, and they have leaf area that's lower than the average. And those lines are just to help you see where the dots are. They don't actually mean anything. So this is one strategy that seems to lead to high performance. Small canopy, start growing grain early, grow grain for a long time. We also found a stress averting strategy that starts growing grain early, but doesn't grow for a very long time. It has a shorter growing season and a very small canopy. And so it looks more like this, where you can see that middle one, the grain filling length is closer to average. A high yielding strategy, and you can see this is different than the stress averting strategy. It's going to transition later in the season, but it's going to live for a long time and have a much larger canopy. And it's going to look like that here. So it has that leaf area that's much closer to average and a grain filling start time that's closer to average. And finally, for this one, we have a compensating strategy. So it transitions late into growing grain as well, but it just lives for a very short amount of time and a very large canopy. So it compensates for having a short time that it grows grain by having a very large canopy. And so it actually looks really different. It has a lower than average grain filling length, but a much larger than average leaf area. And the point of this is to say that there are multiple ways that you can achieve high performance because there are trade-offs between these things. If we come back to this plot and we remember that for both grain filling duration and leaf area, they're working in opposite directions for yield and yield volatility. And so we can get different combinations of these things that lead to high yield, even though you would expect the grain filling start time should be earlier in all cases, but for these other two, we could get different combinations and still get high performance. And if we put them, color them onto this space here, we can see these are 4 strategies that we identified. You can see they're existing in different parts of this yield volatility landscape. So they're different strategies. Those orange ones, remember, had the lower yields, but they had really low volatility. The green ones have high yields, but higher volatility. So the main first take home point is that multiple strategies confer high performance, and there's trade-offs between yield and yield volatility. And so that makes it so that you can have these multiple strategies. All right. So let's look at how this changes in the future. So are we going to have the same strategies in the future? First, a bit about how we defined future. So we took our present day meteorology at these sites, so I should say historical meteorology at these sites, and we added climate anomalies on top of that. So we took a spatial pattern of temperature, which I'll show you on the next slide. That is the multi-model mean spatial pattern of temperature that we see from couple model intercomparison project projections of future climate. And we used a sort of mid-range climate scenario, and we picked a global mean temperature increase. So we picked basically a climate sensitivity, and we took the spatial pattern and scaled it to that climate sensitivity. We assumed that vapor pressure deficit would go up with the temperature change, so same spatial pattern. And we reduced precipitation by a sort of a set amount and set the CO2 to a certain level. So this doesn't explore every possible future climate. It is sort of looking at a possible future climate. It has some spatial information, but mostly we're trying to preserve the correlation between the different parts of the meteorology that we think will be important for the plants. So the fact that the sunlight and temperature are going to fluctuate together in time. I'm just going to show you these end of century ones to start with, but we did them for the middle century. So for each of these, we then again ran our 100,000 simulations. This is what the spatial pattern of temperature looks like. So this is the spatial pattern, then we scaled this to an average global warming of 3.1 degrees Celsius, just in case you're curious. There is a little bit more warming in the north than in the south, and the warming is larger in the summer than other seasons. So the first thing to note is that yield declines for all plant types under future climate. All of our 100 possible combinations have less yield under future climate conditions than they do under present climate conditions. Some of the varieties buffer yield loss more than others. So that's what we're talking about here, right? That's consistent with the Battisti and Naylor paper. They're expecting declines in yield because of increases in temperature. We also find declines in yield in the future. Those declines are not as large if we select for our best performers. I'll show you how the top 20 or so, actually this is all of our top performers. The top 20 are in the gray shaded area at the top, which you can basically not see. Doesn't really matter. So these arrows are showing that, so it's organized across the x-axis from the highest performers today on the left to the lowest performers today on the right. And then we have their ranking of their performance. So this would be the highest performer in the present day. The arrow is showing you how that performance ranking changed as we go into the future. So orange arrows are going down, show you that the performance of that particular trait management combination was worse relative to the other options, and the purple arrows going up show you that it was better relative to the other options. So yeah, purple is improved in ranking and orange is declined in ranking. And so we can see it going both directions here, right? We can see that there are some of these trait management combinations that are doing better relative to the others in the future climate, and there's others that are doing worse. And so we want to understand a little bit about why. If we take this breakdown again and look at the approved in rankings versus the declined in rankings, this is their change in yield, their percent loss in yield per degree Celsius, which is a metric that was also in the Battisti paper. And you can see that the orange ones that declined in ranking, they're losing more yield per degree Celsius than the purple ones, which improved in ranking, but that they're all below zero. The vertical line is zero. So all of them are having less yield, but there's even more yield loss in the ones that decline in ranking. So it's about 7% versus 4% loss. Okay, so these were our strategies that I talked you through before of how you get to high performance, and I'll just give you an update on how they're doing in the future. First, to say that they do shift. So these slow aging ones do about the same, but these stress averting ones basically are very poor performers under future climate. So they, remember, had a short growing season, a short longevity in a very small canopy. And that does not end up being very good for them in the future. So we can isolate them here, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. So these stress averters have an early reproductive start, but they trade that off against the canopy size. So in order for a corn plant to get to the point where it grows grain, it has to grow all of its leaves first. So if you want to grow a lot of leaves, that's going to push the time in the season where you can start growing grain back. So there's a trade-off between those two things. And so this plant's trade-off was to have a small canopy, but get to reproduction really early. And that is not particularly high yielding, but it is low in volatility. And so it could still lead to high performance. And the reason it was low in volatility is that there were some times that these plants weren't finishing. So the plants with long growing seasons sometimes don't finish their growing season. And that means that their volatility goes up. So if you try to grow a really big canopy and you don't make it all the way through your growing season, you'll have low yield, or you won't even make it to the end of the season. These plants had get to it early, and they have a small canopy, so they were always finishing their season. And so it was kind of this trade-off between being smaller, but still having this fairly consistent, fairly dependable yield. But under a future climate, that just doesn't work as well. When the temperature goes up, they can grow through that leaf growth phase faster. And so the plants that have larger canopies do better, because they're no longer risking not making it through their season. Basically, that risk is going away. And so the benefit that this plant with this trade-off had isn't helping them out anymore. And they're basically, it's a missed opportunity to have a longer growing season. So it relaxes this trade-off between reproductive start time and canopy size, which means that you get some different strategies. And we see that larger canopies tend to do better. Some of the smaller canopy varieties or trait management combinations aren't doing as well in the future. So we see that these other two do well, these high yielding and compensating strategies still do well in the future. We also see some new strategies that come into being successful. We see ones with very large canopies with slower development and long growing seasons. So they look really different, but they're, again, because they can get through the growing seasons under warmer climates, they're not risking that loss of yield if they don't make it. And so they're able to do better. And then we have some middle ground ones that are also doing okay. So the second take home point is that the overall yield loss, overall there's yield loss under future climate. These high performing strategies shift with climate, partly due to relaxed trade-offs between the timing of the season and the size of the plant. So kind of last, I wanted to show you a little bit of the difference across locations. So far I've just shown you a very averaged picture of what's happening across all of our sites, but there's a little bit more to learn than just that. So recall that we actually have about 60 locations and about 1,000 site years of data. So let's look across those 60 locations and see if they're all doing the same thing. You can already see from here that there's some performance of other trait management combinations that might be worth understanding. So a little bit about where. So to do this, it's still overwhelming to look at all 60 sites. So we clustered our 60 sites into 3 groups based on their climate. So using temperature, vapor pressure deficit, and precipitation. We've got a cool and wet, a mild, a warm and dry, and a warm and wet. These are the locations that got stuck into each of those bins. So just to break it down a little bit, we're still averaging some of the sites together here, but it's giving us some more difference between particularly the northern locations and the southern locations. So this is, if we break apart those 4 locations, or those 4 categories of climate on the y-axis, this is looking at the performance in the present day. And along the x-axis, we have some of these top performers that we've talked about with these different strategies. And you can see that that first strategy, the slow aging strategy, they just pretty much do well everywhere. And they're very high performing relative to the other strategies. And you can see that some of these ones all the way over on the right are the ones that came in the future. They don't perform quite so well in the present day. So in particular, these slow agers do really well everywhere. You can see for these stress averters that they do best in the cool and wet places. So these were the ones that had the small canopies that didn't end up doing as well in the future, which I'll show you. But they did well in the cool, wet places. So they were able to finish their growing seasons in those locations where plants with bigger canopies were not always finishing their growing seasons. And you can see these high yielders are doing really well in the warm and wet locations. So if we switch this now to the future, this is looking at 2100, you can see that it changes somewhat. In particular, we see that these stress averters stop being very high performing just about anywhere, maybe a little bit in the cool and wet locations, but they're not performing up to the level of the other combinations in the other climate regions. We can also see that the slow aging ones are declining some in the warm and dry locations. So maybe there's some other strategies that are doing better in those places. They're no longer dominating in sort of everywhere. And then these various strategies can buffer the loss in the warmest regions. So there are other ways that these plants are able to achieve higher performance in the warmest places. And again, we're looking within the US, but it would be very relevant to think about this globally. So one last note is to ask if any of these strategies currently exist. So what I've shown you so far is a totally theoretical look at plants that may not actually exist, but that potentially we could create. Do they exist? And the answer is we don't quite know. It turns out seed companies keep the information of the traits that their plants have fairly proprietary. And so it is challenging to get information about what kinds of either genetics or trait information they have about different varieties that their current cultivars. Also, you might be able to find it out about the cultivar, but the information about where the different cultivars are grown is hard to get. So we're looking into ways to learn more about what's grown where now, but we probably need more public information on that. This was one piece of information that Jennifer was able to find. I'll zoom in to just a few of the ones that are relevant to the traits we looked at here. So they looked at what had changed over the historical period from 1930 to 2002. They looked at days to flowering. That's about our grain filling start time. And they said it was no obvious changes there. Canopy size is much more erect, but not necessarily the maximum leaf area hasn't necessarily changed. And the duration of grain filling season though is longer. And so these may not be things that were bred for, or maybe they were. They might just be emergent things that happened based on other targets that companies were breeding crops for, but it's kind of interesting to think about. So not exactly consistent with what we found would be beneficial. So our third take home is that various strategies can buffer the yield loss in the warmest regions. That has implications particularly for outside the US where it's even warmer. And further work and more public data is needed to understand the trait space of existing cultivars and where they're grown. Okay, so this is just showing you the outline one more time, and I would be happy to answer lots of questions if you have them. So that's all. Yeah.
Just a clarifying question, but first of all, thank you also. Under climate change conditions with slow aging, we're declining in the warm and dry. But then you talked earlier about how the slow aging could do okay when it's warmer because it's kind of speeding up everybody. I think that's just one way of understanding. Like when we were talking about animals.
Yeah, so there could be other trade-offs with water, right? Is what I'm guessing. That in general, just temperature. You would think that if they're slow to age, that could be okay under a warmer climate, but there must be something else going on with water, that those ones are using a lot of water, and there must be other strategies that are able to, that are managing that water differently in some way. Yeah, there's more to understand here for sure. There's so many dimensions in this data. Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering about irrigation and how that, I mean, when you make these projections into the future, do you assume that it's all rainfall?
Yeah, we only looked at rain-fed corn. I should have specified that. And so irrigation would be another management practice that you could use to change the performance. Yeah. But it was really hard to figure out exactly how much was irrigated. I mean, to learn about irrigation, you can learn about sort of irrigation capacity. It's a lot harder to figure out how much people actually irrigated. So we didn't end up looking at that specifically.
So all of these are dry.
They're all rain-fed, yeah. And we did apply a decrease in precipitation, which is sort of approximately what's seen, but we don't have a lot of confidence in precipitation projections. So.
Is that why you focused
Yes, sorry, I missed saying that. We focused just on rain-fed, and it had to have a certain amount of corn grown. But if you look at the map, it lines up with where most of the yield is in the US. So there's a small amount of corn grown in the West, but most of the corn is grown in the East or the middle.
So most corn is rain-fed.
In the US, most corn is rain-fed. We did eliminate some places because of irrigation. Trying to find that map. Here it is. So that green in the background is the yield in the US. So there's not a ton of yield elsewhere. Yeah, there's a question back there.
Mine's kind of twofold. Like, first off, like, is this being done with like multiple plants? You just focused on maize for this lecture. And also, like, is there connection between like your findings and like an agricultural institute that's starting to like develop these seeds, like trying to like make, and breed plants with these qualities?
Yeah, good question. So one, I think it'd be great to do it with other crops, but we haven't done it yet. But I would like to think about that. And then two, I'm interested in finding ways to talk more with people who actually breed crops. But so far, what I've been learning is that their time horizon of what they're looking at, they're just not thinking about climate change in this way. This isn't the way they typically do breeding. So I've talked to a few breeders who think this is really exciting kind of way to do things, but it is not typically the way things are done. So I sort of feel like a climate scientist who's like, obviously, this is how you should solve this problem. But then, yeah, actually finding the people to think about doing it differently is a challenge. But I'm working on it.
Yeah, I was going to ask about wheat, which is another big crop staple.
Yeah. I need a wheat model.
Right. So how did,
We have a question here.
oh
too.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Wondering about, I guess I was wondering was this like just done all theoretically from modeling, or were there like, the like different prototypes of cultivars being planted in these actual places?
This was just us using a simulation. I will say this corn model is developed by growing actual corn and our understanding of what the physiological and growth processes in corn are. So it's a lot of information about real corn growth goes into developing the model and then testing it under real conditions. But this like creating of 100 different random plants is definitely a theoretical exercise meant to inform how you would actually then go about doing the breeding. So then it would be up to a breeder to say, okay, well, I want to target something that's got this kind of growth characteristic, this kind of phase through its seasonal cycle and this kind of eventual canopy size. These are the genes I'm going to target. This is how I could do the breeding to make that happen. But we haven't actually done any of that. But the point of this is that you could do this whole modeling simulation exercise first without actually having to create the plants first. Then you can go grow the plants and start doing all the actual testing and realize some of them don't work at all or something like that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I was like, I know you haven't like studied this aspect there yet, but I think it's like it'd be so interesting to know how these cultivars did that like different. Of course, like the soil has so much impact. Cultivar and stuff like that, and the nutrients available in the soil. So
Yeah.
so many variations.
So just a note about the soils that they will make a difference. We use the local soils for each of these locations in our simulations to start with. So it is actually a combination of the meteorology and the local soil information because that will impact their water availability. But we could start playing with other aspects of that environment space as well.
Presumably they're all fertilized.
We removed nitrogen limitation for these because in the US nitrogen is very heavily overused, and so generally wouldn't expect a lot of nutrient limitation, but that wouldn't be true if we're looking elsewhere on the globe.
Here's another question.
Yeah, so I'm curious if you consider ozone as another issue, given that ozone can block some of the specific mechanisms going on in photosynthesis. And in some areas, ozone is actively an issue, especially regionally and locally. So is there any sort of consideration or any genetic understanding of how ozone may differ from
So we definitely didn't specifically consider ozone. What ozone does to plants mostly is it damages the stomata. It makes the stomata not be able to open and close properly. And so that inhibits their ability to regulate their water loss mostly. So there are some models out there for ozone damage on plants and what it does sort of physiologically. What I don't know is if there are other traits that can overcome that loss. It's a little bit beyond the mechanisms that we're looking at here, but it's an interesting question of like, are there more ozone resistant traits or characteristics that could be bred? Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I wanted to remind people, if you look at the schedule,